We will return to we will return to Uchimura Kanzo momentarily, but we need to talk about some political developments in Japan. So, in the late 19th century, Japan, as we talked about, is willing to undertake radical reform in order to make the country stronger. And one thing that's really interesting during this time period is that if you look at the strongest countries in the world, there are places like Britain, the United States, and France. These are all countries that have some form of democracy and a constitution that gives people certain rights. Now, the British Constitution is not a written constitution, but there still is an understanding that you have certain rights. And there's an argument that this kind of liberal democracy is a government in which you respect people's rights to things like freedom of speech and so on and so forth, that these make you strong. And of course, it's easy to see that argument when the strongest countries in the world all have that kind of government. The one exception is Russia did not have a written constitution this time period that limited the form of the government, and it's the rights of the government, and it's the weakest of these powers. And in fact, Japan will defeat it in a war that is fought between 1904 and 1905. So the Japanese government says, we're going to have a constitution. Now, here's the tricky thing. Remember I said earlier that Japan had looked at the Western countries and the practice of Christianity there and saw that religion could be used to unify people, and that Western governments were very interested in making sure that religious freedom was respected in Japan. So this is kind of a conundrum for the Japanese government. We want to use religion to unify people. Of course, that religion wouldn't be Christianity because there's not many Christians in Japan. But at the same time, we have to respect religious freedom, which could lead to division in order to make the Western countries happy, right? So Japan, on one side, they would like to use religion to unify people. On the other side, powerful countries allow freedom of religion. And Western countries want freedom of religion, in particular, so they can spread, missionaries can work and spread Christianity. How do you square that circle? How do you have these two kind of contradictory things? And so what happens is when Japan does unveil its constitution in 1890, it does give freedom of religion, but it is a very kind of limited one. Japanese subjects shall, within the limits of law not prejudicial to peace and order and not antagonistic to their duties as subjects, enjoy freedom of religious belief. Holy cow, right? That goes, before you even get to the freedom, it gives all these reasons why you can take away the freedom, right? You can have the freedom so long as it's within the limits of law and not prejudicial to peace and order. Holy cow, that's really expansive. And not antagonistic to their duties as subjects. That's, again, really expansive. Then you can enjoy freedom, not of religion, but of religious belief, which is a little bit different. Religion, if you say freedom of religion, that entails that you can act on your religion and that certain actions you take on your religion should be respected. Here it just says you can believe what you want. Doesn't really say much about action. But the key thing here is that we can look at this as a glass half empty thing and say, this is very limited. But the key thing is in this time period, this is actually quite a bit of freedom. And it would imply that Christianity has the right to exist. Remember, Christianity is not legal in this time period formally. They stopped persecuting Christians and they took down the signboards that said that, Christians are bad. But they never came out and said Christianity's fine. Here, it's creating a space for Christians and other religious people to have some limited freedom. Maybe not as much as people would like to see today, but for the time period, this was seen as an improvement by Christians. Christians in Japan were happy with this. So here's the thing, though. What counts as a religion? Not Shinto, right? And what happens is the Japanese government will, earlier, it had separated what it called sect Shinto and shrine Shinto in 1882. The first sect Shinto is said sect Shinto is said to be religion. The second is not, right? So the first would be things that are kind of popular religion, while the second tends to be Shinto shrines based on the emperors. This means the state Shinto can be funded by the government and people can be pressured into participating in it. So the idea here is that what the government was trying to do was say, we'll use Shinto to unify the people. So on one hand, we're giving freedom of religion. On the other hand, we want to use religion to unify the people. The problem is we just gave people freedom of religious belief, at least. How does that work? Well, what we'll do is we'll say that some kinds of Shinto are not actually religious. So, for example, various prayers to mountain gods, we'll say that's religious. But going to the shrine of a former emperor and bowing, that's not religious. That is just showing respect to the emperor. And that means the government can fund this. And of course, we can expect you to do this because to go and participate, to bow there, because this is merely a patriotic, secular act, not a religious act. Now, from my perspective, as someone who studies religion, this is a religion, right? You're literally going to bow at a temple or shrine, I should say, where spirits are believed to be enshrined. I don't know how this is not a religious act. But the key thing is, from the point of view of the government, the idea here politically is that this solves this problem. It says people can have religious freedom in certain extents, but they're expected to also follow this kind of baseline function of unity through ritual. We're just saying these rituals aren't religious rituals, right? So you can believe what you want as a Christian, but the idea is that you need to still perform these basic rituals that will unify the people into good Japanese subjects. That's the idea. Now, again, what makes this kind of tricky is the Constitution says some interesting things about the Japanese emperor. It says, the Empire of Japan shall be reigned over and governed by a line of emperors unbroken for ages eternal, and the emperor is sacred and inviolable, which makes the emperor sound a lot to me like a religious figure, right? It's not 100%, but this sounds, saying that this is like eternal, that we'll always have emperors. That's interesting. And the emperor is sacred. That's interesting as well. It is implying, but it doesn't say outright that this is religious, but we're getting towards religion. Now, here's one thing I think is interesting is the United States, sometimes we argue a lot about what the Constitution means, right? There's different interpretations of the Constitution. Just think about Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms. There's lots of different interpretations of what that means. So, and sometimes one thing that people ask is like, well, what did they mean when they wrote the Constitution, right? And that's one way of interpreting the Constitution, is trying to figure out what they meant. What's interesting is Japan's case is that the Constitution was basically written by one guy, an advisor to the emperor named Ito Hirobumi, and he wrote a book explaining what he meant. So he wrote the Constitution, and then he said, just in case the Constitution isn't clear enough, I'm going to write a book. So let's see what he says in his commentary on the Constitution of Japan. Right, and he says, the sacred throne was established at the time when the heavens and the earth became separated. In other words, in the beginning. Right, I'm using that biblical phrase on purpose. Right, saying in the beginning there was a emperor, and it will continue forever. The emperor is heaven descended, divine, and sacred. Holy cow, that sounds to me like he's a god. In Europe, religion is the foundation of the state. The feeling of the people is deeply penetrated by and rooted in religion. In our country, however, the religions represent no important force. In our country, what alone can be the foundation is the imperial house. So he recognizes this basic problem. And I just want to point out, this is kind of the issue when we try and apply theory to practice, right? It's really easy sometimes to be highly critical of people. It's important, I think, and I say this as a historian, we need to understand what causes human behavior, is that people are often trying to balance competing pressures, right? What Japan was trying to do here was or the Japanese government here is trying on one side to say, let's have religious freedom because that's what Western countries like. We need to keep them happy, and countries that have religious freedom tend to be powerful. At the same time, we want to unify our people because we had a civil war a bit ago. We're afraid of conflict. We want to stay stable and unified because otherwise we're afraid that we're going to be taken over by other countries. So we need to find some way to unify us. Let's use the emperor to unify us. And if that means that we have to say the emperor is kind of sacred and all these things that are kind of religious, that's fine, because we'll also say that the rituals around him are actually secular and patriotic in nature, not religious. Does this make sense theoretically? No. Does this make sense politically? Yes. So it's kind of a tricky thing. Okay, so all that was important to try and understand, again, the idea of Christians in the empire, and that brings us to the Uchimura Kanzo incident. So the same year the Constitution comes out that gives these limited freedoms, and it wasn't just religion, it was freedom of speech, freedom of press, things like that, limited, but there. The government also gave the Imperial Rescript on Education, which is basically a document. We won't, if you took my modern Japanese history class, we actually read parts of it. We won't read it here, but basically this document says, be loyal to the emperor and do what the government says. Basically, the idea is that, and the Japanese government is fascinating how it does this during this time period. One said it will expand freedom with the Constitution. As limited as it was, it did expand freedom. On the other side, they're going to say, now use your freedom responsibly. And that's what the Imperial Rescript on Education does. It says, be loyal to the emperor and do what the government says. And you kind of think about it. Just to ask you kind of question, think about why you're here getting an education. And chances are you may say something like, I want to make more money, or I have this passion. There's a subject I'm really interested in. I want to be an artist, and this is what I need to do. I want to be a musician. I want to teach history. All these things. That's what you're here for, right? From the Japanese government's perspective in the Imperial Rescript on Education, education exists for the good of the state, not so much for your individual development. You are being educated to be a good subject who serves the state with your talents that you gained from education. And this wasn't just, in a sense, a piece of propaganda that you were expected to read. You were actually expected to memorize it. And starting in 1891, there would be ceremonies where they would someone would read the Imperial Rescript, and then you were supposed to bow. And I believe you were bowing in the direction of the emperor. So this creates kind of a difficult issue if you're a Christian, because it's a little confusing, because the government says that this is a secular patriotic ritual. It is not religious. But if you're a Christian, this sounds like kind of religious in a way, right? You can't be 100% sure, though. It's kind of religious. It's kind of not. It's really confusing. And to show you how confusing it is, so the idea is you were supposed to give a deep bow to the, bow at like, I think 90 degrees. So like this, right? Like this. What Uchimura Kanzo does, and he's a school teacher, right? Uchimura Kanzo is a school teacher. When his school does this, they have this bowing ceremony. Uchimura nods. He nods. He doesn't do a 90-degree bow. He does like this. And I think that shows the ambiguity, right? And again, it gets really confusing because a 90-degree bow, that's a bow you do to a human being. But if you're doing it in the direction of the emperor, what does that mean? If you're facing towards the rescript, what does that mean? What does all this mean? Uchimura Kanzo is not sure. It makes him uncomfortable to bow completely. But he also, as a Christian, but he also feels like he should show some sort of respect, so he nods. This creates a firestorm of controversy. There is a lot of anger in Japan about this. A lot of people write, especially there's this very strong feeling among Buddhists that they don't much, that sees Christianity as a competitor, very critical, and say this is proof that Christians cannot be good Japanese subjects. That if you become a Christian, you're a bad Japanese. And Uchimura Kanzo was under such criticism. I mean, this is a really patriotic guy. This really hurt him, I think, to have people say he's not patriotic. He actually fell sick, and he would send someone to bow for him. He was too sick to go himself, so he sent a substitute. And that was not enough. That did not make people happy. And he lost his job. He was forced to resign. His wife fell ill and died. He'd been married multiple times. And his own health suffered. And so after this, he can't get work as a teacher anymore. He will become a journalist and social critic. And so it shows this kind of difficult place. And that's why I like to talk about this, that Christians find themselves in Japan, is that you are going to have this very devout Christian community in Japan that wants to figure out a way to be truly Christian and truly Japanese. And they can find it very, very difficult to do so. And what this often leads them to do is to become, as this book describes Uchimura Kanzo as, a modern prophet. And I want to stress, biblically, prophets, we often think of in terms of prophecy, like telling the future. It's not exactly what prophets do in the Hebrew scriptures, the Bible. What the prophets often do is they call on people to be moral. They call on people to repent. And that's what Uchimura Kanzo is going to do. So the key thing here also, we see the government doesn't need to control people. The government didn't come down on Uchimura Kanzo. It was public opinion that did. Right? The government never said, you have to give up your teaching position and we're going to throw you in jail. Never did that. But the population accepted the government's views and was willing to kind of go after this guy. And we can see how this would be a serious limit to the growth of Christianity in terms of numbers. But as I just talked about, we can also see how it would lead Christians to becoming creative and to a certain extent a suffering minority. And to give you a couple examples of that, we have David Hara Takashi. He's going to become the first civilian and Christian prime minister of Japan. Right? And I think most of the prime ministers before him, and a prime minister it's a little bit complex. But basically, a lot of times when you have an emperor or a king, the prime minister is the one who actually does the job of day-to-day governing. And then if they do a bad job, you just fire them because that way the king or the emperor doesn't get into trouble, right? They can do kingly and emperor things and stay popular. When things go bad, you blame your prime minister. And this guy would be, most of the time, these early prime ministers were military figures or were like high aristocrats. And he's going to be the first one who's not an aristocrat. He was actually born an aristocrat, but he gave up that status and became a commoner. So he's going to be the first civilian, first commoner prime minister. He was also a Christian. He was open about it. He was a Catholic, and his Catholic name was David. Unfortunately, he would be assassinated in 1921, would be stabbed to death, and that's the place where it happened. He was killed. It wasn't strictly speaking because he was a Christian. It was because he had sought to limit military economic growth, not because he was anti-military, but he just said Japan doesn't have the money. We can't have a military that's costing too much money, or it will bring down the economy. We're not a rich country. And that may sound kind of strange because, of course, Japan is an incredibly wealthy country today. In the time period, it wasn't. I want to talk about one other Japanese person who would become prime minister before the war, and that's Takahashi Korikiyo. He lived in the United States for a time and learned English. And while there, he converted to Christianity. Unlike Hara Takashi, he was a Protestant. And he is basically this financial genius. He's a financial wizard. During the Russo-Japanese Wars, he would help, I'm sorry, that should be Russo-Japanese War. There was only one. He helped obtain foreign loans. He was key to that. And he had a deep knowledge of the world outside of Japan. And so he would serve as a prime minister for a short period of time after Hara Takashi's death, and he would be a long-term finance minister. He really knew finances well. And his financial policies, when the Great Depression hit, were helping Japan, but involved military cuts. Right, so we saw that already got Hara Takashi into trouble. It's going to get Takahashi Korikiyo into trouble. And I want to give you some of Takahashi Korikiyo's words. He says, "Our country is poor in natural resources, and I doubt that we can compete in an autarkic economic environment." Autarkic here, it means self-sufficient. What he's saying is Japan can't be self-sufficient. We don't have enough natural resources to be self-sufficient. We have to trade with other countries. We must think of our position in the world and form a budget in keeping with our people's wealth. We need a budget that's reasonable. We can't inflict too much economic suffering on the Japanese people. We are a poor country. Financial trust is an intangible. Maintaining that trust is our most urgent duty. So we have to make sure that we stay on good terms with other powers to trade with them. If we focus only on defense, we will cause bad inflation and that trust will collapse. Thus, our national defense will not be secure. The military should think about this. So what he's saying is the military we can't give all of our money to the military. That's going to cause serious problems. In 1936, and I'm quoting this person, S.C.M. Payne, soldiers broke into his home, found him in bed, cut him off mid-sentence, and shot and slashed him to death while screaming heavenly punishment. Apparently, limits to military spending constituted a sin against heaven. And there you can see the Korikiyo with his, I believe that's his granddaughter, and he looks like Japanese Santa Claus, right? Like it's so, and that's one reason I picked this picture. I mean, these soldiers killed Japanese Santa Claus, which is just terrible. I mean, it's terrible to kill someone, especially like this, but especially you don't kill Santa. So again, we see what's important here. You see this kind of idea of Uchimura Kanzo and later these other Japanese Christians acting as a sense as prophets. If we understand a prophet to be someone who calls people to think about the current situation, to act in a moral way, right? That, hey, we're spending too much money here. We can't afford that. We need to move away, especially with Korikyo. We need to move away towards this path of looking to the military to solve all of our problems. And that leads to their deaths. And the thing was, they were right. It was not a good idea to look to the military, right? We don't have a whole lot of time to go into this because this isn't a Japanese history class, but basically in the 1930s and in the 1940s, the military essentially takes over in Japan. And despite the fact that it doesn't have a good economic base, tries to fight China, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, France, some other country, the Netherlands, and some other countries too. And of course, it loses. Right, so there was something to this. And I don't want to say they were the only ones. There were other people who weren't Christians, but the key thing was you do have some Christians who are saying, "Wait a second, maybe this isn't the best idea." And I do want to point there were Christians who supported the military too. It's just for the sake of this class and time, I wanted to focus on this idea that you did have this creative Christian minority in Japan who were kind of questioning things. But this path towards the military does not work out well. Japan is going to be utterly defeated, hit by 2 atomic bombs. I do want to point out that the second bomb fell on Nagasaki, almost directly above the Urakami Cathedral and Urakami neighborhood. This was the largest Catholic cathedral in all of East Asia, and I think something like a half or more of Japan's Catholics died in the atomic bomb because a lot of them lived around the cathedral. And we'll come back to that a little bit later when we talk about the Japanese Catholic Nagai Takashi.